And I'm really, really happy to be here in Poland. This is the first time I've gotten to come to Poland, so I'm looking forward to Saturday getting out and seeing the city. So let's see if I can get this rolling here. Is there magic? It's magic. That's actually... There we go. Now we're at the start. Cool. We'll rewind. So I'm going to talk about Lean UX, Lean engineering, and Lean startup principles in a big company like PayPal, eBay. eBay's 30,000 people in the company. PayPal is a smaller slice of that, 13,000. A pretty good sized company. And so today I'm going to walk you through a lot of changes we've been going through in the organization to bring a very user-centered design approach to a company that kind of lost its way, kind of a darling of the internet early on, but it had become very, very stagnant. And this is a pretty exciting story, I think. To do that, though, before I talk about Lean UX or Lean engineering or Lean startup, those kind of principles, I'm going to take you back a little bit of history. For me, 1985, when I kind of really got my start in doing software development and user experience design. Because all through my career, I've been both in the design side and engineering, and I continually bounce back and forth because I love the intersection of those two fields. So in 1985, I had the privilege of working with a couple of the guys creating a startup, running one of the first games for the Macintosh. And that was kind of an interesting time period because you got your inside Macintosh book was just photocopied. And the one I have the picture here is the phone book edition, which was the later revision of that. And so if we had this fun experience of dropping out of college for a semester or two, running a game. But I want to take you back in time a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about, just for a minute, about how software development was in 1985 and in the past, and actually how that still influences us today. Because the history, comes forward to the present. So in that time period, imagine, just kind of go back in a time machine with me. 1985, you're developing. There's no internet. There's no email. There's no YouTube. There's no Stack Overflow. None of that, right? I mean, everything you have to do comes out of the documentation you have on your desk or talking to the people in the room with you. So it's really quite an interesting experience when I think back on it. In fact, not too long ago, I bought an old Mac, just kind of nostalgia, and then I hooked it up and got it running. Okay, what do I do now? Other than a few disks I had, I couldn't do anything with it, right? But the experience back then was to roll your own everything, to build everything from scratch. You really didn't have any kind of, a GitHub or any kind of place to go and grab software to start with. The Mac had some things in the toolkit that made it really easy to get started, like you didn't write your own file open box because they already had that. So they had a little bit of reuse, right? This roll your own everything is something that's deep in the software culture. Not invented here concept. The second one I think is very interesting is this whole heritage of a disconnected delivery experience. And what I mean by this is that when we were trying to write our game, everything was focused on getting it on that 3.5-inch diskette. Once you got it on the diskette and shipped it, you better have it right. Everything was focused on delivery and not really about learning. You had no way to connect directly to your users like we have today with the internet, where you release software and you get continual feedback, our quantitative, A/B testing and all these other ways we can do data analytics now. And it's interesting, though, you say, okay, well, that was 1985. That's the App Store, right? You have to put an experience together for a native app. You deliver it to Apple, wait for their approval, 3 weeks later. Then you wait for people to update it, right? So we really haven't gotten away from the disconnected delivery experience and the way we do a lot of our application development today. The other big one that I think still comes forward to today for the past is this culture of a long shelf life. That software still takes some amount of time to build and put together. Thankfully, it's gotten faster. But if you have a culture of a long shelf life in an organization where it takes a lot of effort to get delivery, it changes the way you think about design, the way you think about product, the way you think about engineering, the way you think about everything. Because the effort is so Herculean to get something out the door, everything centers on a date. And you become very date-driven instead of experience-driven or learning-driven. So these three trends that I, experienced heavily in 1985, I see these today. I see these really heavily today. And I see how they influence organizations, how even user experience teams are set up, or product teams are set up, or engineering teams are set up. Now, before I came to PayPal, I was at Netflix for 4 years, and I built the UI engineering team there and worked closely with our experience team and worked on a lot of the experiences. At Netflix, as you can see by the skeleton hanging from the building there, we really believed in the customer was outside the building, and you had to get out of the building to learn the customer. And that was both from doing research, from doing usability studies, but a lot from being very data-driven and doing a lot of data analytics, launching lots of experiences, and being able to do lots and lots of testing. Our mantra was really around failing fast and learning fast. Lots of experimentation. When we launched the PS3 experience, we did that based on we ported WebKit to the PS3 as well as to the Wii. And we provided a WebKit foundation for, in fact, all the TVs and Blu-ray players and that are starting to have Netflix on it. They're based on WebKit. And we did this because we believe that HTML5 was really a ticket for us to be able to build, measure, and learn. To be able to change products on the fly without having to wait for a year or 2 year cycle in the consumer electronics space to update the application. Again, we wanted to get away from a disconnected delivery experience. But all the Samsungs and Sonys and everybody we work with, they were totally in the world of a disconnected delivery experience. So us, the technology choice around HTML5 was solely for that purpose so that we could actually have a very rapid build, measure, and learn cycle. When we launched the PS3, we had 4 different experiences you see here, and we actually had 16 different test cells running when we launched. Mashable had an article that said, wow, this new PS3 experience is awesome. TechCrunch had an article, but they were looking at 2 different experiences. They both said it was awesome, right? Which was pretty interesting. However, in testing, only one of those won out. And not the one that gave the more control, the second from the top, which is kind of what we thought. Users say in qualitative and user testing usability, we want to be able to search and find movies, we want to look at genres, we want blah, blah, blah. That's not what they really do. And they sit on the sofa, they're lazy. We found out in media, people not only don't want to think, they don't want to work, right? Think about it. I mean, you just want to show me something, right? So actually, the one that won out was the one on the bottom here, because it just showed you stuff, recommendations, and that's still been pretty much the winner to the date. But I had an epiphany when I was at Netflix. And this epiphany was really around how much change we went through with our experiences. Up until this point, I'd been more focused on reuse, coming from an engineering perspective. Lots of components, lots of, being able to have long-term maintainability. But I actually discovered that in our experience that we were testing, at least 95% we were throwing away in a year. Did you hear that? 95% we were throwing away in a year. So all of a sudden, you don't design for reuse, you design for use, right? You start thinking about learning instead of this long-term, supporting something to be delivered and kept up, long shelf life kind of concept. I learned that the UI layer is really an experimentation layer. And you have to stop thinking about the user experience as being experience. It's really an experiment in many ways, because we're always learning from our users. We never get it right. We'll never have it completely right. We'll get closer and closer and closer, but we can never, ever stop learning and changing the experience. And actually having to design for throwaway ability, which was a really eye-opener for me from an engineering perspective. Most engineers, if you're not careful, will fall in love with a solution and not the problem. And the secret for designers or product people working with engineers is don't talk solution, talk problem. Everybody rallies around a problem, and we come up with new solutions. But engineering organizations often will have a solution they've invested a lot of time in. Designers do the same thing. You have experience. If you've done all this detail work and you got your Picasso and Photoshop, you don't want anybody challenging it, right? We all have to get back to what the problem is, and the problem is continually learning from our customer what's going to meet the needs. So going to PayPal was kind of night and day from Netflix. PayPal had been, a real innovator as far as bringing, a tokenization of money really electronically. But coming to PayPal, here's what I found in 2011. I found that the company was full of roll your own. Everything was invented here. And if it had any open source to it, they would somehow tweak it to make it require a 20-day training class to learn the technology. Have you ever experienced anything like that? And the disconnected delivery experience, everything was focused on delivery. So, we'd rally, have a big date, things would launch, disband the team. That's when you start, right? But we thought we'd finished because we hit the delivery date. People got their bonuses, congratulations. Meanwhile, Square and Stripe and all these competitors start kicking PayPal's butt, right? Even though, PayPal, we're doing very well financially. But, it takes a while for that to work its way through the system. And eventually, if you don't innovate, get back to innovating, you're not going to beat, your more nimble competitors down the street. And definitely a culture of a long shelf life. To change a single word on the site, 6 weeks. 6 weeks to change a word. Because the risk profile had been turned up so high, concern about, people, the bad guys and the way they do money and the system's failing and you can't fail with money, that the whole system was treated, every layer of the software is treated the same way as being extremely risky to change. And if you don't have a good engineering system where you can make change and experiment, then you're going to be in trouble. Very inwardly focused. At Netflix, the only data we talked about was our members and our customers. The only conversations we really had was about our experiments. At PayPal, I get there, it's all about software productivity or the lack of it, and internal metrics and vanity metrics and all this other stuff. You're like, wait, I've entered a new world, right? And very risk averse. But fortunately, some of us came in, had different DNA. David, Marcus, we'd acquired a startup called Zong, mobile payments company. David was the CEO of that company, 150 people, a serial entrepreneur. John Donahoe, our CEO of eBay, said, I want David to be the president of PayPal. And so he took over after Scott Thompson, went to Yahoo. You may have heard the story of Scott, who turned out not to have a computer science degree and lost his job at Yahoo. But David became president, and David has the DNA of a startup. So he walks off the stage from being announced president. He calls the CTO and says, I want a skunkworks. I want to reinvent checkout. And so James calls me and said, put together a rockstar team, which we did, and we started working on reinventing checkout, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So the change is starting to work its way out. We just launched at South by Southwest our new developer experiences to a lot of praise and excitement, really nice APIs. We've got a lot more stuff coming there. We're reinventing our merchant experiences, our consumer experiences, a whole bunch of stuff. I can't show you yet because we haven't publicly announced it in the press, but they're rolling out in test right now. So if you're one of the ones who gets that, if you're in an area that has PayPal. But let me talk just a second about Lean Startup. So Lean Startup, if you just really want to get down to the basics, it's really about what does it take to build, measure, learn, and from that be able to pivot quickly and not chase after a bad idea or chase after bad experiences, right? And it's really about minimal viable product, putting out the features that are most going to touch the most pain points as quick as possible so you can learn. And I like to think about it as minimal viable everything, and not just minimal viable product, but getting to the pivot. Lean UX takes the Lean Startup principles and builds on it and says, okay, instead of focusing user experience on delivering documentation, the Picassos and Photoshop, instead focus on building experiences together collaboratively. And I talk about three principles when I talk about Lean UX. I say you have to get to a shared understanding. You have to have deep collaboration, and you have to have continuous customer feedback. How much documentation should you have? Well, how much shared understanding do you need? And can you get it in a more lightweight manner? Can your prototype, can it be your living spec? Maybe not in all cases, but in some cases it can. So you start with minimal viable instead of having maximum everything, overthinking and overanalyzing. Lean engineering, which is I'm actually writing a book in the series Lean Startup called Lean Engineering, and it really follows these same key rules about shared understanding and deep collaboration and continuous customer feedback, but it focuses the engineering instead of on delivery and reuse so much as it is about to not be afraid to throw away, to not be afraid to experiment, to chase learning and growing as a stack to get experiences to our users. So I'm going to leave you with 3 principles that I've learned, at PayPal as we've been changing the organization and completely changed the way we've done our experiences. The first is, as an engineering team, and I'm going to come at it from an engineering side, a user experience engineering team. I lead all of the UI engineering at PayPal. Is we have to engineer for experimentation. So this sets a different context for your engineering organization as a partner to user experience and a partner to product. And it comes from the fact that experiences have to learn. If you look at the book How Buildings Learn, which is a book about building architecture, and it discusses, buildings have adapted over time. And the way they've adapted over time is they have many layers, or shearing layers, as Stuart Brand talks about. It's a recognition that all buildings are just predictions, and all predictions end up being wrong at some point. And there's no escaping from this grim syllogism. I like that. It's kind of depressing in some ways, but it's also encouraging in others if you embrace it. And our software is the same thing. Every time we release something, it's a prediction. That's all it is. And the more data we can get, the more, talking to customers and continuous feedback, the closer we can get our prediction to reality and what we need to be. And recognizing that these layers change at different velocities allows us to tailor an engineering stack that lets the UI part move as fast as possible because it's going to throw away. And I think the biggest challenge that most organizations actually have is moving from a culture of delivery to a culture of learning. And I want you to think about that with your company, the people you work with. Are you more focused on the date and the time, or are you more focused on learning? And I think if you change that one thing, it'll fundamentally change the way you do everything. So what we did to do checkout, to reinvent checkout, which is 75% of our revenue, $3.5 billion worth of revenue, $120 billion worth of payment volume runs through checkout, so it's huge. 116 million users, etc. Was we got product design engineering in the same room. And we started a cadence of weekly cycle. And in the first 3 days, me and my partners built the first experience of the new checkout. And by the next week, when we had the design folks on board, because we already had a balsamic mock-up to kind of run with. We got the design folks on board on that following Monday. We started sketching on the whiteboard. And instead of turning to Azure, which is a fine tool, or turning to some other prototyping tool, we wanted to create a forcing function with design. We said, no tools right now. We're going to actually live code whatever you sketch on the board. And I got my best engineers in the room who can do that. And that's the way we worked. So on Thursday, we went to usability testing. 5 users came in, built-in time in between to do rapid iteration testing environment where you change throughout the day. Engineers are in the room, products in the room, design's in the room. Friday retrospective, talk about what we learned, what we heard from our customers. We fail together, we grow, we succeed together. And then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, building new experiences, mobile first, responsive, all those sort of things like that, all the good buzzwords. And I remember when we first did the sketch, Cody's on the board, my design partner, he's sketching, and he said, okay, cool. This is awesome. This is really coming together. And so what should I do? Should I put this in Azure? Should I put it in OmniGraffle or Photoshop? And Jeff on my team just turns the laptop around and says, try it out. And so he tried, he goes, what's my job? What am I supposed to do? And Cody, what you just did, that's awesome. Thinking, using your design experience to get us in the ballpark. Now we'll get to customers and we'll learn, right? And so it really was an exciting way to do it. If you think about PayPal's normal experience was, a spec gets created by product, it gets thrown over the wall to the project management organization, which then throws it over all the engineering organization, which comes back with dev days. And then finally, thank you, finally the design comes back and starts working on the design, and then the engineers get to the very end and say, what the hell is this? Right? So a totally different experience. We enable Lean UX, a Lean UX track, basically on top of the Agile tracks. So Agile does not have a brain, by the way. Agile will just produce whatever crap you put into it. You put crap in, you'll get crap out. And you get it very incrementally and very iteratively. It'll be awesome. You'll ship it all the time. You'll ship crap very frequently. But Lean UX, this track gave us the ability to run even, we ran 8 weeks ahead actually, in this particular one. We generally try to run at least a sprint ahead or 2 sprints ahead. Rapid iteration, go into testing. That's the sprint. Learn, 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 learn. Then the same UI bits we use in that layer, we actually share down into the product, the actual production layer, and then we push stories down from what we learn from the Lean track. The second is refactoring your way out of debt. Technical debt kills you, and we had it in spades. And the thing I've been preaching is to go to minimal viable everything. The smallest teams possible, smallest process, the smallest amount of technology, the most open source you can go. And look at what startups are using and make that our pattern. Zuckerberg says, how will the startup down the street do this tomorrow? Let's do it like that now. And we always have to constantly be looking at, what the new innovations are. So here's what we did. It was kind of a trick I pulled off the engineering side to make this happen. We had a very Java-heavy approach. We wrote Ajax by subclassing a Java controller. Total nonsense. Not easy to prototype. So we brought Node.js in, Node JavaScript, which is a JavaScript, on the server side, and we brought in templating. It was JavaScript templating, which allowed us to run our templating both on the server or the client, which fits well with page-based or a mobile really well. And then we tweaked the Java stack to run something called RhinoScript, which runs JavaScript in the Java VM. And that allowed us to take the same UI bits we had on our prototyping stack that we could just turn around in seconds, minutes, and we could drop that on top of the production stack. And now what we're doing is we're moving to one stack. We actually have a project called Kraken, release the Kraken, the sea monster, releasing Node in the wild at PayPal. And it's becoming our production stack. And we're actually launching one of our biggest initiatives on Wallet, our digital wallet. It'll be both on the Java stack and the Node stack to test the two out. But the idea is we'll be able to get to a point where we can have releases every 20 minutes. So a complete difference from 6 weeks from one word to actually pushing the whole UI layer in 20 minutes, which I think is pretty cool. Why are we doing that? Not because these technologies are cool, but we need to build, measure, learn. We need to have the cycle really fast so we can grow. And a lot of experience debt. Our competitors like Stripe and Square, they came about because PayPal slept and had so much technical debt and so much experience debt that our stuff was actual total crap. I mean, the reason I came from Netflix to PayPal was I said, geez, there's so much stuff locked inside PayPal behind these bad experiences. If we could just change a few things, this would be awesome, right? So I went with that in mind. And the last point, real quickly, is really being open source from top to bottom. And I put GitHub up as my poster cat or poster creature. And we're using Bootstrap, we're using Backbone, we're using Node. jQuery, Bower for our component, delivery, a whole bunch of stuff like that. These are all things that are really accelerated. I hire somebody off the street, and literally within a few hours they're checking in code. Versus having, in some cases, it was a month to 3 months before people could check in code. So total difference. And working in an open source model, we actually have GitHub internal. We have the site license for it. I would encourage you either to use the GitHub public repository, the private, make your repos private for your company, or get a GitHub internal, because it totally changes the way your engineering organization thinks. It democratizes coding, it makes it social, and makes it decentralized. It gets rid of this whole concept of centralized teams owning some big foundation software that never ever gets to what you want it to be, because they totally don't understand. All they're thinking about is reuse instead of use. And every developer is encouraged to fork and to try things. And then we have a number of these projects that we're doing ourselves that we're going to release to open source. And doing it for open source creates a discipline, to make sure that your software is done in such a way that anybody can learn it quickly, that it's easy to install, easy to use. The barriers, the bar is pretty high there. And so if you match that bar, you're going to have great internal software. Also, it turns out that if you want to get internal adoption of something, externally releasing it actually helps on internal adoption. And then using GitHub for continuous everything. We're actually now using, what we'll be doing this year is using GitHub for a deployment mechanism so that we actually can push our code to repos, push our content to repos, push our content to repos, and they can go live, running off of watching the repo. The translation process runs that way. Everything runs that way. Again, the changes that we have been able to bring in, around technology, process, and people, has been not because we thought some technology was cool. And I didn't start there, trying to sell it in the organization. I continually talked about things like we have a culture of a long shelf life. We need to get to a culture of rapid experimentation. We need to get to build, measure, learn, which is what Lean Startup's all about. And having those stories like Yrsa, you talked about this morning, right? You're hitting the pain point and you have a story to tell business in business terminology. You can affect change. I say that changing an organization is really two things. It's persistence, based on some strong beliefs, and improv. And those two things help each other, persistence and improv. All right, thank you very much, and we have time for a couple questions, I think.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yes.
Thank you. So, any questions?
Hi, I wonder what happens when there's a rapid prototyping and sketching without the whole documentation. What happens to the quality of the code? Because I guess that PayPal, there are many sensitive situations like transferring your money, and nobody wants to be surprised.
Yep.
Well, what happens to the quality of code?
Yeah, I think there's a couple answers to that. One is it depends on the layer of the software. So the software that's much lower down, that's handling money and transactions and working with banking systems, those sort of things like that, that doesn't change the rate I'm talking about. And usually doesn't have to because they're kind of basic services that are put in place. So that stack changes much slower and has to. But the stack where you have the application, your flows, your logic, your user experience, the bits on the screen that you see or the bits in the phone or whatever, that can change much faster. So that can tolerate that and has less security risk. And I think that's one of the things helping people at PayPal understand there's these sharing layers, the different layers of change. That's one. The other is we go through a very fast pace to begin with on that Lean UX, and it's drawn like a rectangle, but you could probably draw it more like this because the amount of innovation and change you do starts slowing down as the agile stuff starts up. And you can still tolerate a lot of change in the UI, twiddling bits and stuff there, and that's okay. But then we have kind of a hardening phase as it drops down to agile, where we're making sure that it works across all the browsers, across all the devices, and we also build into our framework, our Node framework, for example, and our UI framework, a lot of things that just do things like cross-site request forgery or cross-site scripting, a whole bunch of things like that that might concern us, are built in the framework to protect us against those. And then we also have a lot of components with Twitter Bootstrap and stuff, where that is where reuse comes in, and those give us some stability because those things have been tested out. They have good test first kind of methodology, unit testing, and those sort of things like that. So it's a balance. There's a phase where you really are doing lots of change, and then you get into a little bit more stability. But then at some point you'll cycle back out again. And you'll come back. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can you tell me changing the way you work from the way you describe to Lean Startup?
Yeah.
Have changed your team somehow?
Oh yeah. It certainly it requires less people, for one, right? I mean, although we still have stayed close to the same size. I inherited a team of almost 200. It's about 140 now, because we did some measures of cuts on purpose, because we had way over too many people in some regions. That's one. But the other thing is satisfaction. I was talking to one of our program managers and one of our product managers recently about one of our new merchant experience. I said, so, how's the Lean stuff work? And they're like, oh my God, I would never work any other way. This is so awesome. And I was just, one of the reasons I'm in Europe right now, traveling to the EMEA region, I was talking to our London and Paris and Berlin offices because I need to be hiring. By the way, I need to be hiring engineers in Europe. I'm hiring to be there with my designers in the London office, Paris office, the Berlin office, so they can work this way. And now you can't always get co-location. You know, sometimes you have to be distributed, but that's what we try to prefer and try to get. You know, we're actually changing all of our ways our office furniture set up through the whole company, which is pretty expensive, $20 or $30 million worth of spending, I think, you know, through PayPal, which is large, just to support the concept of lean and agile. Yeah.
Okay, just one more thing.
Yeah.
Has your team changed to support engineers who are building prototypes?
Yep. I'll say one thing. It's not a hard and fast rule that the engineers are always doing they're not doing all the prototyping. But when it gets down to closer to the agile, you know, where it needs to get more real and you want to test that, that's when I insist as much as possible having my engineers do it. Lots of times the designers will create something in Azure, and sometimes we'll test that. But we find it's less useful in the testing than the actual HTML code, you know, whether it's in the mobile tablet or whatever, just because it feels more real. And we also can move directly from that to you know, staging for production, right? And that's, you know, it has a bunch of benefits. And now it's gotten to be so much easier, you know, with a lot of the open source software, with Twitter Bootstrap and other things, it's pretty quick to put an interface together, you know. Yeah.
My question is about the structure of your team. So how
Yeah.
many designers do you have? How many researchers? How do they collaborate with
Yeah,
engineers?
so it varies a little bit. Let's take one example. We had 3 or 4, it depended, 3 or 4 UI engineers. We had about probably 5 or 6 designers. There was like, one of those was a content person, because content person had to be in the room. You know, there had to be like, instead of putting in some tool in some other region, they actually were coming with content on the fly, which was kind of fun in the early stage. There was one person doing more production assets, you know, doing stuff in Photoshop to create those assets, you know, we needed for the actual code. There was, you know, 1 or 2 people working. Like we had a member flow and a non-member, so there'd be people kind of divided between those, you know, 1 or 2. And then product folks, we had, you know, one specific product manager who was, you know, for that team, the checkout, for example. There were her boss and her boss's boss were often in the room originally, because this is a very high visibility project. Our president, you know, David, was kind of the project manager, and he was down, you know, bringing people like, you know, our CEO and everybody else through the room. You never knew when he was going to show up, and we did a demo, right? So, I mean, they weren't there just for FaceTime. They really weren't. They were there because it's a critical project. And David had asked us to basically clear our whole calendars out and only focus on this for the next few months, right? It's typically been that. We've typically had, you know, probably, it's maybe a 2-to-1, you know, or close to that with design to engineering. The funny thing is, my UI engineers, I try to keep it really small, so it's 3, 4, 5, whatever. Our engineering counterparts, it's like 30, 40, 50, 60. We got to fix that, right? So they're kind of still crazy and out of whack. But that'll fix on on our new digital wallet. We've got a services team that's finally building RESTful JSON style APIs, and already we can see we can shrink the team that's been doing the application stuff. In fact, my team will start doing the whole application with the Node stuff, and we'll still do it with probably 4 or 5 people instead of, it would have been like 15 or 20. But those other job engineers will be able to focus on things like building our personalization platforms, our demand generation platforms. Instead of being tied up building these experiences, they'll be able to build something more high value, which is good.
Yeah, I ask this question because I do feel that engineering force is quite expensive right now, right? We
Yeah.
have more software, not that many more engineers. And actually, it would be an interesting thing to move the effort towards the first design phase. And
Yeah.
put more work in that so that we don't have to do
Absolutely.
so much software.
That's what we've been doing, and it's really worked extremely well. I mean, really, really well. I mean, we built a whole new experience for a merchant, you know, it's iPad, you know, based and everything else, and looked stellar. And we did that in 3 weeks, you know, with just two UI engineers, which before that would have been an army to do that. So that's kind of amped it up, and that, of course, I was working with our design partners, you know, going to testing and testing and testing, right? Good.